Meanwhile, the virus from China continues to plague the world. Not just the Omicron variant, which is spreading like wildfire as we speak, but the fallout of the pandemic in general. The impact will be felt for a long time to come. Here's one of the things it is causing: a giant tsunami of debt. The world over, borrowing has gone out of control. We are staring at a giant pile of debt. How big is this pile? $226 trillion in total. 226 trillion, you heard that right. Global debt has surged, let me repeat, to $226 trillion. This is the biggest surge since the Second World War. Who owes this debt? All kinds of people, governments, households, corporates, everyone. But the biggest surge comes from public debt. That's the money that governments borrow. Their loans are now equal to 99% of the global GDP. The numbers are staggering. Why are governments borrowing so much? Because they have no choice. The pandemic has forced them to do this. Countries worldwide spent big to keep their economies afloat. They had to support their citizens with all kinds of things: free food, medical care, vaccines, health infrastructure, and all of this needed money. So governments had no option but to borrow and meet expenses. The result is this: leading economies are severely indebted. Let me show you a list. The United States has the highest level of government debt, almost $20 trillion. That's more than 100% of its GDP. Japan's situation is alarming. The country has borrowed more than $9 trillion. That's more than 230% of Japan's GDP. China, more than $5 trillion in national debt, more than 50% of its GDP. And Beijing's untamed borrowing is only adding to the problem. Global debt surged by $28 trillion. Advanced economies in China accounted for more than 90% of that borrowing. What is China's share in the global debt surge? 26%, more than a quarter. This could have dire consequences for the world. You see, whenever countries have accumulated so much debt, it has always led to a financial crisis. Allow me to take you back in time. From 1970 to 1989, many Latin American countries accumulated huge amounts of debt. At the end of 1970, the region's outstanding debt was $29 billion. In the years that followed, Latin American governments could not manage these loans. By the 1980s, debt levels in this region reached $327 billion. From 29 to 327 billion. It's an increase of more than 11 times. Here is what happened next. In 1982, Mexico defaulted on its sovereign debt. Argentina and Brazil had to weaken their currencies. A global financial crisis began. A total of 27 countries had to reschedule their debts. 16 of these were from Latin America. The story repeated itself in 2007. Banks in the United States gave out a lot of bad loans. It was a systemic failure. U.S. household debt was allowed to reach well over $10 trillion. That was more than 40% of the GDP. Many of these loans failed. Major banks in the United States collapsed in 2008. The result was this: $2 trillion were wiped off from the global market. US and European banks lost more than $1 trillion. They had placed a bet on toxic assets. Now join the dots. Whenever countries have accumulated massive levels of debt, they found themselves in financial crises. If the current debt is not controlled now, the world will be forced to deal with another financial nightmare. This giant tsunami of debt could trigger the next financial crisis. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.